I was born in Australia, but I lived in Singapore for many years. My business in Asia was successful, and I became wealthy. After 20 years, I decided to visit my home in Sydney. On my way from Singapore to Sydney, I stayed for a week in Perth. I had a friend who lived in the city of Fremantle, and I wanted to see him again. His name was James Foster, and he had been my friend for many years. We had written letters to each other often, but recently, I had not heard from him. James had never worked. His father gave him a small amount of money, so he never had a job. James was a superstitious man. He believed in luck and strange things happening in life. He spent most of his time reading unusual books, especially about occult ideas. I called them books of magic. As soon as I arrived in Fremantle, I sent a message to James' house. The message said, "I am staying in Fremantle for 3 days. May I visit you?" James surprised me. An hour later, he sent a servant to my hotel with a reply. "Come to my house right away, my dear friend," he wrote. "Come this evening. You will remember the house. It was my father's home. I live in a tower at one end. You don't need to ring the bell or knock on the door. I'll tell the servants to go to bed, and I'll leave the front door of the tower open. Come up the stairs immediately. I'll be waiting for you. Please come soon." I took a cab to James' house. That evening, the weather was stormy. A strong wind was blowing, and cold rain was falling. I had forgotten that Australia can be cold and wet in winter. I only remembered the sunny days, not the storms. James's house was near the Indian Ocean. It was an ugly 2-story brick building with a tower at one end. The house was surrounded by a garden of trees and plants. But it was winter, and there were no leaves or flowers. The driver stopped the cab near the tower. Though the front door was only a few steps away, I was soaked with rain as soon as I stepped out. I ran to the door of the tower and turned the handle. The door was unlocked, and I opened it. A small lamp on the stairway gave little light. The hall was full of shadows, and I couldn't see much. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, touching the wall as I went. At the top, there was another door. I opened it and entered a room with another dim lamp. James came forward, shook my hand, and greeted me. He wore a long silk robe and soft slippers. His clothes were old-fashioned and strange. We looked at each other, and I was shocked. I hadn't seen James for years. He had changed a lot. He had once been a handsome man, but now his hair was gray, and his face looked pale. There were deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He looked old and weak, though he was not yet 50. His large eyes shone strangely in the dim room. "Welcome, my friend. Please sit down," he said. James offered me some wine and a cigar, and we talked for a while. But our conversation was not very exciting. Meeting friends after so many years can be awkward and sad. Perhaps James understood how I felt. "I am not what I used to be," he said in Latin. I tried to joke. "Your Latin hasn't improved," I replied. James smiled. "Latin is a dead language, and I am a dead man," he said. Then his smile disappeared. "I will die very soon." I didn't know what to say. I smoked my cigar and drank my wine. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, the wind had stopped. I felt uneasy and wanted to leave. Suddenly I heard a soft noise. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of someone or something knocking. Was it coming from a wall in the tower? Tap, tap. The sound was slow and quiet. It wasn't someone knocking on a door. It was more like a signal, a message. James seemed to forget I was there. He stared at the wall with an odd expression, both excited and afraid. His eyes shone brightly. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? I stood up. "You seem very tired," I said. "I'll go now. May I visit you tomorrow?" James turned and looked at me. "Please stay," he said. "There is no problem. No one is there." He walked to a small window and opened it. I hadn't noticed it before. Look, he said. I crossed the room and looked out the window. I could see nothing but a street lamp and the rain falling. No one was outside near the tower. Please don't leave, said James. I must tell you a story. You are the only one I can tell. Will you listen? I wanted to return to my hotel. James, his house, and the strange sound made me uncomfortable. I believed I was a practical person, but something in that room made me feel scared. Still, I didn't want to upset my friend. All right, I said. I'll stay and listen. James poured me another drink and gave me another cigar. Then he began his story. I didn't move here until after my father died, he said. That was 10 years ago, when I was about 40. I inherited his business, his property, and his money. Before he died, I lived in a large apartment in an old building in Chinatown, James continued. Maybe you know that area? It was once popular, but now it's run down. The building had many small rooms, and the walls were so thin you could almost hear everything through them. I was lucky. James went on. The rent was cheap, and I had a big room. No one visited me so I could study my books. I was happy there. One day, I saw a young woman, James continued. She wore a white dress and a straw hat with colorful flowers. Her face was strange and beautiful. I had never seen anyone like her. Without thinking, I bowed. She looked at me with bright brown eyes but didn't smile or speak. She entered the building and shut the door. I stood there, wondering if I would see her again. Should I speak to her? Would she talk to me? Maybe you think these are the thoughts of a much younger man, said James. And maybe you're right, but these feelings were new to me. I had never been in love before. I spent too many years with books and too little time with people. Now I believe you are my only friend. Soon, none of this will matter. I don't feel silly talking to you. James paused for a moment and then continued his story. The next day, I waited in my apartment. For many hours, I looked out of the window. I watched the street, but the girl did not come out of the building. I didn't know her name, so I couldn't ask anyone about her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I sat by the window again and waited. Then, suddenly she came out of the apartment, and I went out too. But when I reached the street, she had disappeared. I didn't see where she had gone, so I walked around the neighborhood. At last, I saw her in a small street. We smiled at each other. She recognized me, I'm sure of that. From then on, I often went out when she did. She always wore the straw hat with the colorful flowers and ribbons on it. I didn't follow her. I just walked around, hoping to see her again. Finally, I asked the landlady about her. Who is the girl with the pretty face and the straw hat? I asked. She's my niece, the landlady replied. She's a servant here. She lives with me because her parents died. She works for me. She cooks and cleans. Her room is right next to yours, but at the top of the other staircase. Oh, my friend, I wish I'd never heard that information, James said. Her room was next to mine, only a thin wall between us. At night, I put my hand on the wall and thought of her. Was her bed near the wall too? Was she sleeping just inches away from me? I couldn't study because of her, James continued. My mind was not clear. I only thought about her. I couldn't focus on my books about the occult. I never wanted to marry, James went on. I didn't want a wife or children. I only cared about learning, and I couldn't marry a poor servant girl. My father would never allow it. All my money came from him. If he stopped supporting me, well... What happened next? I asked. James looked at me sadly. I stopped waiting for her. I stopped watching her and focused only on my studies. But one hot night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling in my mind. I thought about her again and again. She was just on the other side of the wall. I tapped on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. I did it again. tap, tap, tap. Then I felt foolish. I was acting like a boy in love for the first time. I got out of bed and started reading my books. I was reading a strange book, James said. It was an occult book by necromancers. You would call it a book of magic. In it, necromancers describes how to be a fortune teller. He also talks about strange things that happen 3 times, calling it a fatal triad. He said that when this happens 3 times, death will come. I believe a fatal triad has happened to me. Why? I asked. What happened? While I was reading the book, said James, I heard a soft tapping sound from beyond the wall. It was an answer to my signal. Tap, tap, tap. I knew she was sending me a message. I tapped again. Tap, tap, tap. But then there was silence. She didn't reply again. I listened for hours but heard nothing more. For many days after this, I looked for her, James said. But I never saw her again. I tried to forget her. Then one evening, I went to bed early, very tired. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I heard a soft sound, a tapping on the wall next to my bed. It happened again. Tap, tap, tap. I was going to reply, but then I stopped. She hadn't replied to my last signals, so I didn't reply to her now. James drank some wine and continued. I lay there listening, he said, but I didn't reply. Finally, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was late, and I felt very tired. I needed fresh air, so I went out. The landlady was outside my door. Oh, Mr. Foster, she said, have you heard the terrible news? My heart started beating fast. What news? I asked. My poor niece was sick for a week, she said. Didn't you know? I saw you watching her. Didn't you know she was ill? I was shocked, said James. I didn't know what to say. Yes, I had watched her, but I never spoke to her. My thoughts were always full of books and thoughts of her. How much time had passed since I last saw her? Days? A week? I couldn't remember. How is she now? I asked. I'm sorry, the landlady said. She was very ill last night, and I took care of her. She had one request. She wanted her bed moved next to the wall, next to your room. So we moved it. She felt better after that. She touched the wall and smiled. A few hours later, she passed away. James's face was full of sadness, and there were tears in his eyes. When I heard that, I nearly died too, said James. I didn't know what to say. What had I done? I had sent my thoughts to her, and she had answered. I hadn't used words. I used occult magic. James was silent for a few moments. Then he continued. A few days later, I heard of my father's death, James said sadly. I left my apartment and came to this house. I've been here in this tower for 10 years. I've been waiting for a visitor. I didn't expect to see you, but your visit didn't surprise me. Necromantia says that signs come in 3s. You've heard my story. Now you must decide if this was a fatal triad. I heard the tapping twice before. The first time, I searched for the person who knocked. The second time, many taps came, but I didn't answer. And now you've heard the third tapping. The triad is complete. I stood up and shook James' hand. He knew I understood his sadness. He smiled weakly and said good night. The next morning, a servant brought me sad news. My friend, James Foster, had passed away during the night.